In the awakening room, the noise fades as the crystal light above Dan's head goes out and the system freezes. That doesn't happen. Usually the class name appears immediately, but the board has been blank for 10 seconds, 20, someone chuckling, someone whispering, and Dan stands motionless, counting his heartbeats, not taking his eyes off the gray screen. The second hand on the wall reaches a full circle, the system clicks, and the letters observer slowly appear above it. At first there's silence, as if no one is understood, then laughter comes from the back rows, and a second later the room is buzzing like a market where bad news is being sold. Dan doesn't lower his head. He looks at the description titled, 0-level support class, no combat stats, and next to it are empty lines for attack, defense, and mana, as if they forgot to add it, and this makes him feel better. Everything matches what he expected. The director steps out of the shadows of the podium early, gestures for silence, and comes closer, his voice soft but short. We can issue a waiver of enrollment without consequences, and in these words there is more concern for the reports than for Dan. Dan nods as if he understands, then calmly replies, I refuse to refuse, and the room erupts into noise again, some whistling, some laughing louder than before, and the director pauses for a second, as if trying to assess the system's error. On the way to the exit, someone deliberately bumps into him with their shoulder, checking to see if the Zero class will react. Dan doesn't respond, only shifts slightly to the side so as not to break his stride, and makes a mental note. Pressure through the crowd works better than words. There's a board in the hallway with his name at the very bottom of the list, without a group or a mentor, and next to it is a note saying individual mode, and the teacher on duty, without looking at him, puts a checkmark, as if registering an extra burden. During his first basic tactics lesson, he's placed at the end of the line. The instructor quickly runs through the rules of combat without mentioning his class at all, and when the pairs are formed, Dan is left without a partner, standing against the wall like a piece of furniture. He takes out a notebook, a regular one with a hardcover, and starts writing while the others are practicing their punches. Turn your body on step 2, lose balance when shifting to the right, and next to it, an arrow showing an angle that no one but him can see. Towards the end of the lesson, one of the students misses and almost falls. Dan takes a step forward to avoid a collision and makes a note. The error is repeated in 3 out of 10 students, meaning it's not a coincidence, but a pattern, and writes down another line. In the second lesson, he is again placed last. The teacher already knows his name, but addresses him as an observer, without a last name, as if he is not a person, but a function, and Dan does not correct him. It is more important for him to see than to be called. He notices how the fire mage spends mana to maintain the flame even after an attack, and writes, excess consumption 12-15%, next to which he notes the moment when the mage wrinkles his forehead. This is the point of overload, which he himself is not aware of. In the cafeteria, his place is always left free, not because he is avoided, but simply because he is not taken into account, and Dan sits by the window, unfolds his notebook and compares his notes for the day, crossing out inaccurate wording and specifying reaction times. On the third day, the instructor suddenly calls him forward. Since you're watching, tell me what he's doing wrong, and points to the student with the spear. The room freezes, expecting emptiness, but Dan answers curtly, the step is longer than the strike. He loses control on the return. The student tries to correct it and almost immediately stumbles in a different, worse way, and laughter erupts in the room. The instructor frowns at Dan as if he had ruined the lesson, and does not address him again for the rest of the lesson. Dan returns to his seat and writes down, adjustment without explanation of mechanics causes deterioration, underlines the word explanation twice, and adds an arrow to the note about reaction time. There is a connection, it needs to be checked. At the first team training session, he is assigned to the last group. The captain immediately says, you stay in the back and don't get in the way, and Dan nods, taking a position near the wall, where everyone can be seen and there is no need to move without a reason. When the battle simulation begins, he notices how the defender raises his shield too early, opening the lower sector, and quietly says, lower, but the defender does not hear. The blow goes through, the team loses a point, and the captain curses at everyone at once. On the second attempt, Dan waits and speaks louder, with the same word, and the defender automatically lowers the shield a split second earlier. The attack slips past, and for the first time the team takes no damage. The captain looks back in surprise. After the training, the captain comes up to him and asks briefly, do you see anything else? And there is no mockery in this, only pragmatic interest. Dan answers, 3 things, and lists them, without adding any assessments, only the actions and the time. In the evening, he opens the notebook to the first page, an entry about the director, made in advance from his grandfather's notes, and adds a new line, behavior in the hall, conceals reaction, facial control above average, puts the date, and closes it. After a week, they start listening to him more often, but not always. Half the advice is ignored, half is followed, and Dan notes which formulations work best, removing unnecessary words and leaving only commands of 1 or 2 syllables. During a trap lesson, he sees the activation mechanism for the first time, the subtle delay between pressing on the plate and the release of the arrows, and without thinking, he takes a step back just before it goes off, and the teacher turns around abruptly. "Did you see the trigger?" he asks, and Dan replies, "A half-second delay," without explaining how exactly he figured that out, and the teacher stares longer than usual and writes something down in his journal. At the next lesson, the traps are rearranged, but Dan again goes off track before they are triggered. Now 2 students follow him and remain unharmed, and for the first time the teacher says, "Watch him." In the corridor, the director's assistant stops him and hands him a note. "Program adjustments are possible." It's unsigned, but the handwriting is recognizable. Dan puts the sheet of paper in his notebook without answering and continues on with his schedule. In the dueling auditorium, he sees Rix for the first time. He ends the fight in 20 seconds, without giving his opponent a chance to raise his weapon, and the audience applauds as if at a performance where the outcome is already known. Dan writes down, "The first 4 seconds are maximum damage," then marks the right shoulder, 3 centimeters higher during the swing, and points with an arrow to the sector where the blade does not cover space, leaving a thin dead zone. As he leaves the room, Rix takes a quick look at him and smirks, "You have no business here," and moves on without waiting for an answer. Dan doesn't answer, only adds, "Reaction to the look, ignoring, confidence is stable." His name is last on the exam schedule, next to the no weapons note, and several students take pictures of the list, passing it around as a joke. Dan runs his finger down the line and closes the board. The night before the exam, he doesn't practice. He sits at his desk and rewrites keynotes, removing everything unnecessary, leaving only movement patterns and short commands, as if he were preparing not for a fight, but for instructions. In the morning, he arrives at the arena before everyone else, stands at the edge of the area and checks the distance to the lines, counting the steps 3 times back and forth to make sure the numbers match the records. When his name is announced, the room is already set for laughter, but he comes out without haste, stops in the center and looks at Rix, neither challenging nor avoiding the gaze, simply fixing the position of his shoulders and feet. The referee gives the signal. Rix takes a step forward, and Dan doesn't move, counting the seconds, 1, 2, on the third Rix speeds up. Just like in the recordings, the blade follows the expected arc. Dan shifts to the left exactly 3 centimeters, no more, no less. The blade passes by, the air cuts through the void. Rix turns around by inertia, and Dan puts his hand on his shoulder and calmly says, "Stop." Rix freezes mid-step, as if someone had pulled an invisible thread. The blade remains raised, and the shoulder under Dan's hand relaxes before he has time to realize what is happening. The hall goes silent for a second, not understanding why the fight does not continue. The referee raises his hand, unsure what to call. The rules call for a hit or a clear defeat, and here it is neither. Rix jerks his shoulder away and turns sharply, but Dan is already standing behind him, 1 step further. "Keep going," the referee says, trying to get the fight back on track, but Rix takes an extra step, losing his position, and Dan finds himself out of range again, not accelerating, simply missing the punch. The second exchange lasts less than a second. The blade passes by twice, and each time Dan shifts a fraction of a step, as if following a predetermined line. Rix clenches his teeth, speeds up, breaking his own rhythm. Dan steps to the edge, not allowing himself to be driven into a corner, and says briefly, "Left below." Rix lowers his blade for a split second, the reflex kicks in, and this micro-shift breaks the next blow. The judge hesitates again, and shouts of "hit already," and "what is this?" can be heard in the hall. Rix takes a step forward with extra effort, his shoulder goes higher than usual, and the blade goes wider than it should. Dan steps forward into the vacated area and touches his shoulder again. "Stop." The voice is the same, without pressure, and Rix freezes again, this time longer, as if catching himself repeating himself. The referee lowers his hand, time, without pausing, and declares a draw. The audience roars louder than at the beginning, because the result does not meet any expectations. Rix leaves the area first, not looking at Dan, but his step is harder than before the fight, and his shoulders are tense differently. Dan notices this and turns towards the exit, not expecting a reaction. On the bench, he opens the notebook and writes, "Stop reflex, confirmed, radius 3 seconds after attack," then adds, "The enemy's acceleration breaks his own rhythm," puts the date and closes it. In the hallway, a dueling instructor approaches him, stops too close and quietly asks, "Where did you get this from?" Dan replies, I observed, and takes a step back, clearing the distance. You didn't win, the teacher says, as if testing the limits. Dan nods, according to the rules, no, and leaves without adding anything, leaving the question hanging. On the second day of the exams, his opponent is an earth mage. The area is strewn with slabs that can rise, and the mage immediately raises a wall, cutting off Dan's path. Dan doesn't try to break through, he stands and watches the magician hold the structure, and notices a trembling in the lower left segment, as if there is not enough power there, and records this in his memory. The mage increases the pressure, raising the floor beneath Dan's feet, but he steps to where the plate has not yet been activated and remains in place as blocks rise around him. Move, the referee shouts, but Dan doesn't move. He waits for the moment when the magician turns his attention to the top line, and says, bottom, without raising his voice. The magician automatically strengthens the top, leaving the bottom empty. The wall loses support and collapses. Dan leaves the sector without touching a single slab, and again puts his hand on his shoulder. Stop. The judge declares a draw faster than last time, without trying to figure it out, and the magician lowers his hands, looking at the destroyed structure, as if he is seeing his own technique from the outside for the first time. After the fight, the magician comes up and asks, where? Dan points to the lower segment and briefly explains, delayed recharge. The magician nods and leaves without thanks. A new entry appears in the notebook, pointing out a point of weakness without explanation works, and an arrow points to the note about wording. Dan crosses out the unnecessary words again. The third fight is all about traps and distance. The enemy plants triggers on the floor, and Dan sees the activation sequence as a chain, with one element always delayed. He steps between the slabs just before the chain closes and passes through the field without activating a single trap, making the enemy nervous and speeding up the pace. The acceleration throws the order off. One of the plates goes off earlier than it should, and the chain breaks. Dan ends up in the center, where there are no active triggers, and says again, stop. The referee looks at the scoreboard, then at the floor, then at Dan, and declares it a draw without a pause, as if he had adopted a rule that did not exist yesterday. The audience is no longer laughing, but they are not applauding either. People are looking more attentively than before, as if it were a problem that cannot be solved in the usual way. After the exam, he is called to the principal's office. The office is empty and too quiet. The principal doesn't offer him a seat, but immediately says, you are creating problems with the regulations. Dan replies, I follow the rules, and places the notebook on the edge of the table without opening it. The director looks at it longer than at him. You're not causing damage, says the director, but you're changing the outcome. Dan nods, that's not prohibited, and remains silent, offering no solution. The director approaches the window, turns away for a second, then returns. You will be assigned an observer, and there is irony in this word, which he does not hide. Okay, Dan replies, takes the notebook and leaves without asking questions. An assistant is already waiting in the hallway to accompany him. The assistant walks alongside, trying to keep up but not get in the way, asking questions about the recordings. Dan answers briefly, leaving only the facts, without methods. During training, an assistant stands behind him and tries to understand what he is looking at, but he sees only people's movements, without structure, and after 10 minutes he gives up. Dan writes, observation without context is useless, and adds, context equals repetition plus attention to deviations, emphasizing deviations. In a team mission, he is placed in the center of the group, not on the edge. The captain says, speak up, and this is already a role change that Dan notes. When the fight begins, he gives short commands, right up, step back, wait, and for the first time the group acts in sync, without arguing, because there is no time. The enemy changes tactics, tries to break the line, and Dan's timing is off for a second. One of the students gets hit, falls, and the team loses its position. The captain looks at Dan sharply, one more time, and there is no anger in it, only a demand. Dan nods and reduces the commands to one word. On the second attempt there is no mistake. The group holds the line and the enemy retreats. The training ends without losses. The captain briefly says, fine, and this is more than praise. In the evening, Dan returns to the error entry and writes, 0.2 second delay, critical, adds the fixed tag, and transfers the wording to the final version. At the next exam, he is placed not last, but second to last, and everyone notices this, but no one comments out loud. The hall becomes quieter until the fight begins. The enemy is a shooter, the distance is long, the arrows come in series, and Dan sees the rhythm of breathing that sets the release. and moves between the series, and not from the arrows. One arrow passes too close, touching the sleeve. Dan notices the error in choosing the point, but does not change the pace to prevent the shooter from changing his position. He comes within touching distance between rounds and says stop. The shooter lowers his bow before he even realizes what happened, and the referee declares it a draw again. After the fight, the shooter catches up with him in the corridor. Are you counting your breath? Dan replies, I'm looking at my shoulders, and moves on without explaining how exactly. By the end of the week, the teachers stop joking about him and start watching him more often, standing closer to the playground, as if checking to see if he's breaking something invisible. During the fight analysis, the instructor puts up a recording of Dan on the screen for the first time, freezes the frame before the attack, and asks the group, why did he miss? The answers are the usual ones, speed, distance, but he zooms in on Rick's shoulder and remains silent, forcing them to look where no one had looked before. Dan stands against the wall and doesn't intervene, but when the teacher nods to him, he says, the center is off by 3 centimeters, and there's a pause in the room because the number is too precise to guess, and the teacher writes it on the board. After class, 2 students approach him and ask to look at their technique. Dan agrees to one exercise and gives each one a correction, no more, and both immediately make it worse because they try to correct without understanding. He stops them with his hand and adds a second phrase, do it slower, and only after that the movement evens out, he writes down, speed hides the error, and underlines slower is the key. The assistant brings a new order. Dan is to attend senior classes as an outside-level observer, the term clarified in parentheses as non-participating, and he nods, accepting access. In the senior hall, everything is faster and harder than he has seen before. The strikes are more powerful, the magic is more complex, but the structure is the same, only the deviations are more subtle. Dan stands by the column and does not move for almost the entire lesson. One of the elders, noticing his immobility, comes up to him after the fight. What do you see? And there is no mockery in his voice, only a check. Dan answers, excessive effort on the return, and points to a point on his forearm. The elder tries and gets a blow from his partner, winces and nods. Later, putting off the edit, Dan writes, the level of resistance to edits increases with experience, puts a mark, requires time. The next day, he is called to a joint training session between 2 groups. The task is to capture a control point. Dan is placed in the center, but is not allowed to touch the point. The rule is added separately. He gives commands in short words. The group moves faster than usual, but the enemy changes the pattern and goes around. Dan pauses for a second, assessing, and loses the pace. The enemy takes the point first. The captain glances at Dan. Too late, and there is no anger in this, only a fact. Dan nods and notes, assessment without action is a loss. In the second attempt, he does not evaluate for more than a second and gives the command to cut. The group is divided into 2 lines and intercepts the bypass. The point remains neutral, time is gained. After the lesson, the captain says, speak up early, even if you're not sure, and Dan writes down, an early signal is better than a late one, and moves it to the list of rules. In the library archive, he finds his grandfather's old notes, pages marked active use, and compares them with his own, noticing similarities in the wording of the commands. He rewrites one of his grandfather's schemes, interception through the enemy's perception, clarifying the term in brackets, channel of feelings, and adds his own example with traps. The assistant brings a notice about the final exam, clearing an S-class dungeon. The explanation, enemy without vulnerabilities, the goal is to survive for 20 minutes. Dan rereads the wording twice. On the day of distribution, his name is included in a strong group as a replacement for someone who dropped out. The captain looks at the list and briefly says, you will speak, and this is no longer a request. Before entering the dungeon, the instructor reminds them of the rules, adding, the observer does not touch the objects, and looks directly at Dan, who nods without arguing. It's dark and damp inside, the floor vibrates with the sound of his footsteps. Dan slows his breathing and listens to how the sound changes from different surfaces, registering the map not with his eyes, but through his response. The boss appears immediately, a massive figure with no obvious weak points. Attacks come in series, the defense closes in without breaks, the team lines up and takes the blow. The first 2 minutes pass steadily, then the boss's rhythm changes. One of the students doesn't have time to readjust and gets hit, falls, the team squeezes tighter, losing space. Dan stands behind and does not give commands. He looks at the floor, at the boss's reaction to his steps, at the delay between the vibration and the rotation of the body, and does not move so as not to make noise. In the 7th minute, the second one falls, the captain clenches his teeth and shouts, "Hold," but the line is already breaking. The third one receives a glancing blow and retreats, the space narrows to a minimum. Dan steps forward and says, "Stop," and the team freezes for a split second, even the captain, and in that pause he adds, "In line," pointing with his hand in the direction. "Why?" asks one of the remaining ones, but Dan is already in position, and they repeat after him, lining up perpendicular to the boss's axis, the term being clarified out loud, axis, direction of attack. The boss turns his body and attacks as one target, the vibrations of the floor merge into one signal, Dan records, perception through the floor unites, and immediately says, "Disperse." They diverge in 3 directions, and the boss spends seconds reorienting himself, losing his rhythm. The captain strikes the designated sector, the second one in another, the blows land where the defense has not yet closed. Dan doesn't attack, he counts 1, 2, 3, and at the 3rd second he says, "Line again." They come together, uniting the signal, and then separate again, repeating the cycle. The boss tries to change the way he perceives it by increasing the pressure on the floor, but this only increases the delay, so Dan adds, "Faster," reducing the cycle to 2 seconds. One of the fighters is a split second late, takes a glancing blow and retreats. Dan changes the formation, 2, leaving one outside the line to reduce the risk. The cycle becomes shorter but more stable, the blows become more accurate, the boss's defenses don't have time to cover all the sectors, and after a minute his movement slows down, the rhythm is completely destroyed. The captain makes a final lunge at the marked spot where the defense has not closed, and the boss falls, the blow echoing loudly across the floor, the vibration disappearing like a sound turned off. The judge records the time, the 9th minute. There is silence in the hall above, as before the announcement, then a short signal, the exam is finished early. The team stands motionless, as if waiting for him to continue. The captain looks at Dan and says, "Explain it again," and there is no doubt about it, just an attempt to maintain the pattern. Dan replies, he sees through the floor, and makes a line with his foot, "We are 1 signal," then spreads his arms, 3 signals, he loses. The captain nods and repeats out loud for the others. As he leaves, the instructor says nothing, just makes a note on his clipboard and looks at Dan longer than the others, as if checking to see if he missed anything. In the corridor, the head of the commission approaches him, says quietly, "It looks like an archive," and lingers his gaze for a second, as if comparing it to something from the past. Dan doesn't answer, he takes out a notebook and writes, "Perception is the key," adds, "signal merging/separation," and puts a mark S-class confirmed. In the evening he is called to the director again. The office is the same, but on the table lies a folder marked expulsion. The director does not open it, but looks at Dan over the cover. "You're breaking the classification," he says, "but not formally." Dan nods, "Not formally," and puts the notebook on the table without opening it. The director slowly opens the folder, flips through the pages with dry formulations, then closes it and pushes it aside, as if the decision is postponed, and says, "We will have to rewrite the rules," without specifying where to start. Dan doesn't answer, he opens the notebook and turns the page with short commands towards the director, not as evidence, but as a tool. The director looks without touching, and looks away, as if he doesn't want to remember. "Do you understand the consequences?" he asks, and for the first time his voice sounds not like control, but like caution. Dan answers, "Yes," without adding anything, leaving room for others to draw their own conclusions. In the corridor, Rick stops him, looks straight ahead and without a smile, one more time, and this is not a challenge to a scheduled duel, but a demand to check something that does not fit into the usual. They walk out onto the empty court without a referee. Rick raises his blade and waits for the signal. Dan doesn't give it, just stands there, and the pause drags on longer than usual, breaking the rhythm before it even starts. Rick attacks without a command, faster than during the exam. Dan moves not 3, but 2 centimeters, testing the boundary. The blade passes closer than before, and he records the new value. In the second exchange, Dan doesn't say stop, he's silent, and Rick doesn't freeze. He finishes the series, the blow catches his sleeve, leaving a thin line, and Dan takes a step back, changing the distance. "Speak," Rick says between blows, and it's a request, not an order. Dan says, "Lower," and the blade drops for a split second, giving an opening, but Rick maintains the rhythm better than before. Dan puts his hand on his shoulder again, "Stop," and this time Rick doesn't freeze completely, just slows down, as if learning to resist, and this is a new variable that Dan mentally records. They stop at the same time, without a judge and without result. Rick lowers the blade, works less, Dan nods, adapting, and both understand that the scheme is no longer the same. A note appears in the notebook, the reflex weakens with repetition, an arrow to the note about commands, and next to it the word variability, underlined once. At the next lesson, the senior class asks Dan to give commands in a fight against two opponents, adding the condition out loud, no repetitions to test the limits. Dan reduces the language to gestures and directions, showing with his palm the sector where he needs to stand, and nodding at the moment when he needs to move. The team understands without words, but with a delay. One of the elders doesn't make it in time and gets hit. Dan changes the scheme to a combination of gesture and word, minimal, and the delay disappears. He writes down, transmission channels, combined. After the lesson, the teacher asks him to formalize the method. The term is clarified, a set of rules. Dan answers, it's a set of observations, and does not agree to turn them into a fixed list. In the library, he finds a section marked by his grandfather, do not pin ahead of time, and runs his finger down the line as if on warning, then closes the book and takes it into the hall. During training, he deliberately gives the wrong command in a safe situation. The group performs worse, but does not fail, and he records the reaction. Trust drops by 1 level, no more. After the lesson, the captain says, don't do that, and there's no threat in his voice, only a boundary. Dan nods and writes down, trust is a resource, adding a scale from 1 to 3. The assistant brings a new assignment, participation in an intergroup review, where decisions are recorded by a committee. The term is clarified, external assessment. Dan accepts it without asking questions. There are 3 people sitting in the commission room. One of them is recording without pauses. Dan stands in the center of the group, and the captain nods to him before the signal, passing the initiative. The scenario is more complex than usual. The enemy changes tactics every 10 seconds. Dan gives commands in advance, 1 step ahead, and makes 1 mistake, anticipating the wrong shift. Mistake costs the group its position. One of the fighters falls. The commission does not intervene, recording the outcome. Dan immediately changes his approach, wait, and gives the command only after the change has occurred. The tempo drops, but the errors disappear. The group regains control, and by the end of the scenario, they hold their position. The committee notes the time and looks at Dan without comment. After leaving, one of the committee members says, you speed up and slow down the system. Without specifying what this means, Dan writes down the phrase verbatim, as someone else's definition. In the evening, he opens the first page of the notebook, the entry about the director, and adds, intervention limited, then puts a question mark next to the word class, leaving it unanswered. In the corridor, his assistant catches up with him. The director asked me to tell you not to go into the upper levels. The term is clarified, senior groups. Dan nods, but doesn't ask what will happen if he doesn't listen. The next day, he is still assigned to the seniors class, without explanation, as if the system itself is ignoring the ban, and the teacher pretends that this was the plan. In a senior fight, one of them falls due to a rare mistake. Dan steps forward and says, stop, stopping the chain, then adds, right side empty, and the team changes direction. The teacher does not stop him, even though the rule forbids interference, and this tacit permission is recorded by Dan as a change in the boundary. After the lesson, the teacher comes up to him, I didn't see that, and these words are not a denial, but a defense against being told. Dan nods and leaves without confirming the event with words. New line appears in the notebook, boundaries are not only set by rules, an arrow to the entry about the director, and a note next to it, observe more often. Rix finds him again, this time not for a fight, but with the question, what should I change? Dan looks at his stance and says, shoulder, pointing to the point. Rix nods and asks, more. Dan makes a second correction, shorter breath. Rix tries it, loses the power of the blow, but the speed increases. He grins, not for free, and accepts the change. 2 days later, Rix wins the fight in 15 seconds, not 30, and, passing Dan, nods briefly without stopping, and this is recorded as a result, not as an attitude. In the library, Dan finds another note from his grandfather, the observer must not be seen, and closes the book because this no longer fits the current situation. He writes next to it, visibility increases influence, and puts an equal sign next to it with risk, without specifying where the line is, because there isn't one yet. During another training session, he tries not to speak at all. The group starts making mistakes more often than before, and the captain then says, don't disappear. Dan writes down, presence is a factor. The assistant informs him that he is being assigned 2 students for training. The term is clarified, skill transfer. Dan accepts, but immediately limits himself to one edit at a time. The first student tries to apply 3 tips at once and fails, the second makes one correction and improves the result. Dan notes, the load must be dosed, emphasizing one. In the evening, he flips through the notebook from beginning to end, stops at the entry about the director, and adds 3 signs of a hidden class, adding specific details of behavior that he saw in the hall. He closes the notebook and looks out the window at the academy, where movements have become patterns for him, and people are sources of deviations, and this will never change back. Down in the yard, there's an evening training session going on. Someone makes a mistake in the same place as a week ago. Dan turns away from the window and doesn't go there, leaving the mistake uninterrupted. He returns to the desk and writes on the last page, ready for next step, then adds below, undetermined, leaving room for wording. The light goes out in the hallway, the footsteps become more distant. Dan closes the door and puts the notebook under his arm, like an instrument that has already become part of the movement, and not a separate thing. At the exit of the building, an assistant is waiting for him with a new envelope without a seal. He hands it to him silently. Dan takes it without opening it and continues walking without changing his pace. Inside the envelope there is a short line, Level 2 Archive Access. The term is clarified, restricted collection. Dan stops for a second and folds the sheet back. He turns towards a staircase leading down where he has not been before and takes the first step, not knowing what he is looking for, but knowing that it is a continuation, not a deviation. The stairs down muffle the sound of footsteps, the walls become colder, and on the second flight a sign appears saying Level 2 Archives, Restricted Access. The term is familiar, but here it feels like a warning, not a formality. Dan swipes his card and the door opens with a delay. Inside are not books, but closed cells with class labels and names, some crossed out, some undated. Dan walks down the rows without touching anything until he finds the Observer Archives section, which is almost empty. There are only 3 folders inside, one old with a worn cover, 2 new ones without signatures. He takes the first one, recognizes his grandfather's handwriting and immediately sees the note, Active Use, Prohibited, underlined twice. He opens a page describing interfering with the enemy's system. The term is clarified, breaking the pattern, and next to it is a short entry, effective, but causes a system response. Dan lingers at this point longer. He hears a footstep in the hallway, closes the folder and puts it back without taking it, because the access rules are unclear, and goes out into the common room, where his assistant is already waiting for him, clearly not by chance. The director asked not to linger here, he says without raising his voice. Dan nods and leaves without asking a question, but a line later appears in the notebook, Archive, Control Zone. The next day he is put into training with an unknown opponent, no name or class, only the marked test, and the area is empty, no spectators, only 2 teachers against the wall. The enemy comes out unarmed, but his movements are so precise that Dan immediately sees that it's not a student, but someone older, perhaps a teacher who doesn't reveal the class, and this matches the recording about the principal. The fight begins without a signal. The opponent attacks in an unconventional way, changing the rhythm every 2 seconds, and Dan cannot predict the pattern in advance. He has to react in the moment, which he almost never did before. The first exchange goes smoothly, the second is delayed, and the opponent touches his shoulder before he can move, not a strike, but control. Dan notes, prediction doesn't work. He changes his approach, stops looking for structure and starts looking for deviations within deviations, minimal disruptions in rhythm, and finds one, an overly smooth transition between phases. In the third exchange, he moves not to where it is safe, but to where the opponent expects not to see him, and this gives him a split second. He puts his hand on his shoulder, stop, checking the reflex. The enemy doesn't stop, just smiles and continues moving, and this is the first complete disregard for the command. Dan takes a step back, noting, the reflex is not universal. Dan doesn't try to repeat the stop, he changes the distance and rhythm, starts moving with a delay of a split second after his opponent, not before, and notices how he speeds up a little, trying to regain control. This is the new entry point. He takes a step inside the strike, where he hasn't gone before, and for a moment finds himself too close. The opponent shortens the range, losing power. Dan notes, close range breaks rhythm control. In the second cycle, he repeats the entry, but moves a centimeter to the right, checking the border, and receives a touch on the shoulder, not dangerous, but precise. He writes in his head, the border is narrow, requires precision. You're changing, the opponent says for the first time, without stopping. Dan doesn't answer, only shortens his movements, removing unnecessary steps, and begins to breathe more briefly, as he advised Rix. He notices that the opponent does not attack immediately after the change of rhythm, leaving a micropause, and during this pause Dan makes a shift, not to the side, but forward, occupying the center, which he had previously avoided. For a moment they are face to face, touching distance, and Dan says not stop but wait, testing the new command. The enemy does not stop, but slows down, as if assessing. This is enough to get out of the attack line without a break. Dan takes a step to the side and notes. The team changes speed, not the action. A new category appears in the notebook later. The fight continues for several more exchanges, none of which give a clear advantage. The teachers at the wall do not intervene, watching as Dan's behavior changes. At the end, the opponent takes a step back and lowers his hands, signaling the end without words. Dan stops at the same time, without trying to prolong it, and this is recorded as agreement. That's enough, says one of the teachers, making a note. The second one doesn't write anything down, just looks at Dan longer than usual, as if comparing with expectation. In the corridor, the assistant doesn't ask questions, he just walks alongside him, but the pace of his steps changes. He now adapts to Dan, and not the other way around, and the small change in role is noticeable. A new page appears in the notebook, classes without a stopping reflex, and on the first line Dan writes, unknown, probably hidden, puts the date in notes, check again. He returns to his grandfather's entry and adds, the system's response is enemy adaptation, emphasizing adaptation, and draws an arrow to his notes about Rix. At the next training session, he deliberately doesn't give commands in the first 30 seconds. The group starts to act according to the old patterns and makes 2 mistakes in a row. Dan intervenes later than usual. The team is making progress, but the losses are higher. The captain then says, you're waiting too long. Dan nods and writes down, the time to intervene is critical, adding a scale from early to late. In the library, he opens a second folder from the archive, a new one, and signed. Inside are reports on anomalies in exams. The term is clarified, deviations from the norm, and he is mentioned in a few lines. He reads without emotion, noting what parameters are recorded, reaction time, lack of damage, change in outcome, and adds, observing the observer, and closes the folder. At the exit, the same teacher from the inspection meets him and says, you're not the only one we're looking at, without specifying who else. Dan nods and moves on without asking names. In the evening, he reviews the list of students in his notebook and adds notes to some of them. Adapts, does not adapt, dangerous if repeated, creating a new classification on top of the old one. Rix arrives later than usual and asks, check again. Dan agrees and immediately gives another adjustment, not related to the shoulder, checking for tolerance. Rix tries it and maintains the result. It works, he says briefly, and this is no longer a surprise, but a confirmation. Dan writes down, transfer of edits is possible, adding the condition with trust greater than or equal to 2. The assistant brings another letter, this time with a stamp, admission to internal teacher training. The term is clarified, closed training. Dan looks at the stamp and does not open it right away. He puts the letter aside and goes to his regular class without changing the schedule, as if checking to see if anything will change without his participation, but the teacher immediately moves him to the center of the group. You lead today, he says, and it's not a request. Dan steps forward and reduces the commands to gestures, testing the group's ability to cope without words. The first few seconds are a bit slow, then the rhythm evens out and the group begins to move as one, without any vocal commands. The teacher does not interfere, watching from the sidelines. Halfway through the script, one of the students loses his tempo, and Dan adds one word, now, and that's enough to restore synchronicity. He notes, the word is the synchronization trigger. After the lesson, the teacher says, you're building a system on top of a system, without specifying whether this is good or bad. Dan writes down the phrase verbatim as a guide. In the evening, he opens the sealed envelope and reads a short invitation with time and place, no signature, only the phrase, Level 3, a new term, he adds in brackets, above the archive. He closes the notebook, takes her by the arm and leaves the room without stopping, as if the decision had already been made, and heads down the stairs, where the light goes out earlier than upstairs. On the first flight he stops, remembering his grandfather's note about the system's response, and adds on the last page, the beginning of the response, puts a period, and goes down further. The stairs to level 3 are now unmarked, just a metal door without a handle that opens as he approaches, as if he had already been expected. A coincidence Dan doesn't note down, it's too obvious. Inside, the hall is empty of spectators and unmarked, only 3 figures at the far edge, all unmarked, and the floor vibrates slightly even though no one is moving, which immediately introduces a new variable. One of them takes it a step further, testing without rules, the term is clarified, no restrictions, and this is the first time the wording is expressed directly, without the cover of regulations. Dan doesn't answer, he steps onto the platform and stops, checking the floor. The vibration is not from movement, but from the hall itself, like a built-in factor that cannot be ignored. The enemy appears not from the entrance, but from the shadow on the right. The movement is silent, and the first attack comes without preparation. Dan barely escapes, moving in an unusual pattern. He doesn't look for a pattern, it's too early. Instead he counts the intervals between attacks, noticing that they are uneven but subject to a hidden cycle that doesn't match the steps. The second attack comes closer than before, and for the first time Dan makes an unnecessary move, retreating further than necessary, noting, overinsurance, loss of position. He closes the distance back, entering the zone where the attack is weaker, and says wait, but the opponent doesn't react, only changes his angle, as if the command was a signal for adaptation. Dan changes his language, no longer giving commands, only moving, and notices that the enemy begins to anticipate his movements, as if the surveillance has become mutual. The third figure against the wall makes a note without interfering, and Dan understands that he is not just being tested, he is being studied in real time, and this is a different level of pressure. He abruptly changes the rhythm, pauses where he was moving before, and vice versa, and for a moment the opponent loses synchronization. This is enough to get out of the line of attack. Dan notes, unpredictability versus observation, and immediately checks. He repeats the same technique, but it no longer works. The enemy adapts in one cycle. Then he does the opposite, he completely repeats the previous pattern without changing anything, and this is what breaks the expectation, creating a split-second window. He enters this window and places his hand on the opponent's shoulder without saying anything, checking his reaction without a command, and feels how he does not stop, but loses momentum. Dan doesn't maintain contact, immediately moves away to avoid being hit, and writes in his head, contact without a command reduces momentum, a new category. One of the observers at the wall says, enough, and the fight stops, not by a signal, but by decision, which marks another difference. Here the rules are made on the spot. You change the system faster than it changes you, says the second, and there is no judgment in his voice, only a statement. Dan writes down the phrase later, verbatim. The third one is silent, but looks at him the same way the director did on the first day, and Dan makes a comparison. The behavior matches the entry about the hidden class. They don't let him go right away, they ask one question, what next, and this is not an exam, but a test of intention. Dan answers, watch, without adding in use. That's not enough, says the first one, and takes a step closer, closing the distance, as if in a fight. Dan doesn't retreat, testing the boundaries outside the fight. He adds a second word, change, and this is no longer an observation, but an intervention. The room becomes quieter, as if this word has weight. Who? The second one asks, and Dan doesn't answer right away, pauses, as if in a fight, then says, the system, without specifying, leaving the scope open. They let him go without a decision. The door opens by itself, and he goes out into the corridor, where the sound of footsteps is normal again, without vibration, as if nothing had happened. In his notebook he writes, level 3, no rules, adds, mutual observation, and puts a mark, response has begun. The next day at the academy, nothing changes outwardly, the same classes, the same faces, but the teachers look differently, a little longer, a little more attentively, and this is the system reacting. Rix arrives to practice early and says, they're watching, without specifying who. Dan nods, I know, and gives him a new edit without explanation. Rix does it right away, without any questions, and the result is better than yesterday. The trust goes to level 3, and this changes the speed of skill transfer. In a team mission, Dan gives a command that is against the standard. The captain hesitates for a second, but carries it out, and the group wins faster than usual. After the mission, the captain says, I don't understand, but it works, and this is a new form of trust, without understanding. Dan writes down, result explanation. In the library, he returns to his grandfather's folder and takes it with him for the first time without asking permission, testing where the line of control lies. No one stops him, and this is also the system's response. He writes, the boundaries shift with the result. He emphasizes twice. In the evening, he opens the last page of the notebook and adds another line to the line ready for the next step, started, without erasing the previous one. He looks out the window at the academy, where movements no longer seem random and mistakes inevitable, and closes the notebook without rereading it. In the corridor, the same steps are heard as in the archive. Someone stops at his door, but does not knock, and this pause is longer than usual. Dan doesn't go to the door, he stays where he is, counting the seconds, like in the first fight, and he understands that now he is not the only one creating pauses.